This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and a different guest pretty much every week. And today I've got Jess Gough. Now, Jess has the most amazing Instagram account and does really fantastic videos on it, which is how I came across her. It's called Happy Smallholding. And what's your tag actually, Jess? Hello, by the way, first of all. Hello, Jess.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My tag is happy_smallholding.
That's it. So I came across Jess because we both love growing vegetables. And Jess is less than half my age. But anyway, she is the most incredible communicator. And so I found, I tend to look at Instagram, not every day at all, but particularly on Saturday mornings I do a bit. And I saw a little short film that she did on rhubarb and all the kind of take-homes that one needs to know about rhubarb. And then I saw her do a similar very good film on, I think it was asparagus or whatever. And it just was exactly kind of what I find as a teacher of growing vegetables is what people want to know. And so I then met Jess and asked her, and we chatted and asked her to come on the podcast because, well, first of all, what age are you, Jess?
31.
So she's young and she is growing incredible vegetables. And do you know what? She doesn't do it full time at all. So Jess, tell us a little bit about your history and how you got into gardening and how you got into growing veg and, you know, give us a bit of background.
Sure. And thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So I lived in London for quite a few years. So when I graduated from uni, moved to London, lived in a shared house with my partner and a few friends, as you do. And we had a little courtyard garden and we decided to start growing. It was actually flowers first. And then I was particularly keen to grow vegetables. So we started with tomatoes and strawberries and just grew that just for a couple of years. But I absolutely loved it. I think didn't really know what we were doing, didn't even read a book to begin with, just kind of sowed some seeds and saw what happened. And then I realized at some point over the summer that the tomatoes needed pruning. So I started to read about it. And then I spent a day in the garden sorting them out. Because, you know, if you don't touch them, they turn into a bit of a jungle.
They do.
And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I just found it so meditative and really rewarding. And then made like one jar of strawberry jam from this little bed of strawberries that we had. But yeah, absolutely loved it. So from there, sort of carried on growing until we were able to get an allotment, which for London is very, very lucky. But fortunately, the allotment that we joined, the guy who ran it, did it in a really clever way. So he had one plot that he allowed anyone to join. So they called it the community allotment. So it meant that at any one point, you'd probably have maybe 15, 20 people all working on this one plot.
Ah, brilliant.
And then it meant that, yeah, I think it's a really good way because waiting lists are so long. But actually, there are a lot of plots on allotments that aren't being used. But this way, people get to join, they get to try it out. They see for themselves whether they enjoy it. If they love it, they can move on to a full-size plot. If it's not for them, they just disappear. And some people just like the fact that they can come along when they want, but there are other people also working alongside them. So it's less hard work. So that was really lucky.
How did you share the produce?
Yeah, good question. It was kind of whoever was there. So because my partner and I were always there, we got to take quite a lot home. Some people just didn't like certain vegetables, so, you know, they'd give them to other people. And then we also had a very small bed that was like ours. So all of that stuff would be for us.
Okay.
But yeah, it just worked quite well. No one ever ended up fighting. I think there was one argument over a squash once, but apart from that, it was it worked quite well. And then, we moved to our small holding in Somerset about 18 months ago. So it's a couple of acres, and we built our vegetable garden as soon as we moved in. That was kind of the priority. We wanted it to be quite sort of, we wanted the structure to be quite good. So we put some proper paths in. It gets very wet here. We live on the Somerset levels, so there can be a lot of water in the winter. So we needed it to be quite robust so that we could still get out there in the winter. We dug some paths over the winter, put in a watering system that's fed by rainwater. And 18 months later, we've got lots of lovely homegrown fruit and veg.
That's fantastic. And what are your absolute, okay, so this is going out sort of June, July time. What are your absolute stalwarts that you've got out there growing now, and what varieties of them?
So at the moment, we've got peas out there. We're a bit boring and we grow Hurst green shaft, which I think is quite a bog standard, but it is really tasty. And then we're trying a few heritage varieties this year. So Glory of Devon, and one that's just called green shaft. Glory of Devon's quite cool, actually. It's huge. I don't know if you've grown it before, but it's grown really tall. It looks impressive. It's a good sort of 2.5 meters tall.
Well, the good thing about tall varieties of peas is that there was one that was famously found, some seeds were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and the archaeologist, whose name escapes me momentarily, anyway, he distributed seed, that he grew it out in his own garden and distributed seed around the stately homes of England. And Chatsworth still grow this Tutankhamun seed, and that is really tall. And the brilliant thing about it, you've got to stake it fantastically well, but the brilliant thing about it is that it means it goes on growing, flowering and cropping from almost twice as long as any other variety, because it's so tall. So it's just growing, on and on it goes, rather than reaching a certain height, stopping and cropping heavily. So they're really useful for the domestic grower, these very tall varieties. But people are scared of them because they think, I'm going to have to pick from a stepladder. But you don't, but they just do give you a much longer harvesting season.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So you get a lot more crop for your space, don't you? Because you're not taking up any more space on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, sorry, you were talking about potatoes when I interrupted.
Yeah, potatoes this time of year is so exciting. I love digging up potatoes. It's like panning for gold, but we grow one particular variety called Red Duke of York, which is just beautiful because it's so red and it's really early as well. So we've harvested a few of those already, but they'll go on for another few weeks.
Brilliant.
And broad beans, of course.
Yes. So should we talk about broad beans? And actually, you very sweetly sent me some recipes, and one of the recipes that I saw was for broad beans. So should we chat about that?
Yeah, great. So one of my favourite ways to use broad beans is a broad bean and basil pesto. You could just use your normal pesto recipe. I have a nut allergy, of course. I'm allergic to a lot of things, so I use seeds instead of nuts. So I toast sunflower seeds and then use that in the pesto along with the usual basil, Parmesan cheese, some oil, some lemon juice. And then I blanch some broad beans. So I pod them, blanch them, pod them again, and then put those into the pesto and just whiz it up. And it adds just like a really nice sort of sweetness to the pesto. So I love doing that in the summer.
That sounds so nice and so creamy. That's delicious. So we'll put Jess's recipes in the podcast notes. So don't worry, you don't have to write it down. So going back a bit, when did you start? When was the first time that you started growing veg, and who taught you? Literally, did you? You imply you just got stuck in and didn't have a teacher, but I just wondered, like, which books you went to or which websites or whatever.
Yeah. So my parents did always have lovely gardens. They never grew fruit or veg. I would occasionally help. I always enjoyed the destructive part of gardening, like digging out, tree stumps and that kind of thing. So I helped my mum a few times in the garden doing that kind of thing. But growing vegetables was definitely from books, and also just kind of learning as you go as well. I think gardening is actually quite intuitive. And so you can kind of test things out and see how it goes. But my go-to book, it's called The Complete Guide to Self-Sufficiency by John Seymour. It's very old. And I know there are a few sort of methods in there that definitely you wouldn't use it out. So he uses peat, for example, which of course we wouldn't touch now. but it's just quite a sort of wholesome book because he was a smallholder and he was, I think he was sort of almost completely self-sufficient. So the book covers everything from growing veg all the way to brewing your own beer and looking after livestock and slaughtering it and then butchering it. So it really is the complete guide. But I love that book. And then my partner, he was reading Monty Don's book. There's some veg in there. So we sort of taught each other as well, because I'd be reading about peas and he'd be reading about potatoes, and we'd kind of, exchange notes. So yeah, it's been nice doing it with someone as well.
Yeah, definitely. And do you grow flowers as well as vegetables? I mean, do you have some flowers in your garden now?
Yes, lots of flowers. I think if you're growing vegetables, as I'm sure you agree, because I've heard you speaking about biodiversity a lot as well, you kind of need to grow flowers in order to have that balance in the garden. So flowers bring in a whole host of beneficial insects that are going to pollinate your veg, and then they're also going to prey on pests. So yeah, we grow a lot of flowers as well. I'd say actually the vegetable garden is probably maybe 30% flowers. So it's definitely a real mix. Yeah.
And do you pick quite a bit to bring into the house, or not so much? They're more just out in the garden?
Yeah, I do like picking and arranging flowers. So at the moment, I've been picking sweet peas, foxgloves, cerinthe. I like putting fennel in flower arrangements just because it's quite sort of airy. And then, yeah, because sweet peas, because the more you pick them, the more you get. I quite like to pick them while they're flowering and bring them into the house because I love the scent as well. It's quite nice sitting at my desk working, having the smell of the garden in the room with me.
Definitely. And so in terms of veg or flowers, are there any particular things that you passionately want to urge people to get to, like this weekend, and sow and grow? I mean, obviously, we're in the mid-season now, aren't we? But it's always good to remember you don't want to hang up your sowing gloves, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so easy at this time of year to forget about the winter. And it's definitely this is definitely a good time to be sowing sort of winter brassicas, so like kale, cabbages, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then coming back to the summer, I think it's just about okay to still sow sweet corn. At least I hope so anyway, because I've just been sowing. Okay. I've just sown some more because some of it didn't work. So fingers crossed. And then courgettes, and then anything that kind of crops quickly. So things like beetroot, salad, as long as it's not too hot, or if you've got a shadier spot, that'll all crop quickly. So yeah, there's plenty of time for that kind of thing.
Brilliant. And I know you're organic, aren't you? And so will you just chat us through, I don't know, how you kind of manage, I mean, particularly this year where slugs and snails have been so bad because it's been so wet. So sort of pests and weeds and kind of what your toolkit is in a way.
Yeah, this year has been really tough for slugs. And I feel really sad for people who have just started growing this year, because I just want them to know that this isn't normal, because it can just be so disheartening when you plant something out and it gets eaten straight away. But I think the best thing you can do to protect your crops against pests is to sow into pots or module trays first and keep them out of harm's way. So if you've got a greenhouse or even just a table outside, and really don't plant them out until they're really robust plants with thick stems, for two reasons. The first is pests love the newer growth, so they're going to go for little seedlings because that's like, I don't know, caviar to them. Not that I eat much caviar, but and then the other thing is seedlings that are small. That's like one mouthful. So, you get one pest, take one mouthful and that's it. Whereas if you've got a big plant, even if something has a little nibble, it's still going to be able to withstand that and carry on growing.
Yeah, really good point.
And then with slugs, I honestly just go out with a torch and collect them all and chuck them over into the farmer's field next door. And there's a water course running between us, so I don't think they can get across.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that is. And then I have tried beer traps with slugs, and it seemed to work. There were a lot of slugs in the beer traps.
Yeah.
When I came back to them, so I'm assuming that was effective.
Yeah.
And then things like having a pond so that you can encourage things like frogs, toads, things that are going to eat slugs. A lot of birds also eat slugs or slug eggs. So particularly birds in the thrush family, like blackbirds, thrushes, even robins. So I think trees and hedging are quite important to have around the garden as well, somewhere for them to shelter. And they'll come out and hopefully give you a helping hand as well.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. That's what we're big fans of that here. And then what about weed? How do you keep on top of the weeds, particularly in wet springs like this one where loads of weed seeds germinate so readily? How do you keep on top of that?
So there's like the classic way of picking weeds out. But I think that the earlier you do that, the better, because if you allow a weed to go to seed, obviously you're multiplying your problem by, potentially 100, depending on how many seeds are being given off. So little and often, I think, with weeding is the best approach. But I also quite enjoy the lazy approach, which is just trying to sort of crowd weeds out so that I don't have to do too much actual weeding. So I think an autumn mulch is always quite a good idea because that, if you put a thick mulch on, that's going to cover the seeds and they're not going to be able to reach the surface. And then if you're not using a bed for whatever reason, just put something like cardboard down so that you don't have to keep going back to that bed and weeding it. And then finally, if you are using a bed, I think it's quite like my favorite way to crowd out weeds is just to plant lots of stuff in a bed. So if you're growing tomatoes, interplant it with lettuce, for example, and then that's going to cover the soil and it's going to help sort of suppress the weeds because they won't be able to get light. But yeah, that's definitely my favorite way because it means I don't have to do quite so much weeding.
And we have a bit of bindweed in the garden here because we're organic too. And we've found that we actually put our potatoes in the beds where the bindweed is at its worst, because you think that when you're digging the potatoes, you're actually going to spread the spaghetti. But actually, we've found it quite effective at getting rid of those sort of quite deep, penetrating weeds. Have you tried anything with perennial weeds?
To be honest, no, but I like the idea of potatoes. Is that because you just sort of naturally dig them up as you're lifting the potatoes?
Yeah, and I think weirdly, it opens up the structure of the soil, so with all the tubers pushing out, and so it actually becomes much easier to get quite a mass of the spaghetti out. So in our trials here, we've found it really pretty good. So we're trialing potatoes as a soil cleanser for ground elder as well this year, and we'll just see what happens there, because we there are two main perennial weeds here now, because we've got ground elder in the bases of hedges, which then tends to creep out, and again because we have so many hedges for exactly what reason you've said, which is for birds nesting and forage and stuff. But it does mean that things like bindweed can creep in quite easily on a farm scale, and it is a bit of a problem for us. But potatoes seem to be really, really pretty effective at cleaning it all up. And then I know, just sort of looking into the future, one of the reasons that I've come across you is that you've started doing a bit of teaching, haven't you, at home, where you have groups and you're teaching them how to grow veg. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I find with Instagram, you get 20 or 30 seconds to sort of get your point across and that's it. And I think I'm missing that sort of human connection. So I really wanted to welcome people here and spend a bit more time teaching and sharing a little bit more knowledge, and also showing people and letting them see for themselves. Because I think it's very different looking at something on a screen compared to coming into a garden and seeing it for yourselves, because you can get all your senses involved when you're at a place. You can smell, you can feel, and I think it's a lot better for someone's education to do it that way. And also there's a bit of a practical element as well, because we'll do a bit of seed sowing and a few other things, so people get to just try it for themselves and see with me kind of there. Not that it's difficult, but there as like a confidence boost to tell them that they're doing it right. So yeah, I'm doing a course sort of like once a month at the moment, and then I'm also doing a few sort of talks at different events as well, which is exciting.
Very exciting. And one of the things that's impressive about Jess is that she actually, as I mentioned at the beginning, has a full-time job, I believe. I mean, you certainly did when we last chatted, and so fits this around her life. And am I right in thinking that that's the sort of nucleus of a book idea of how you can actually grow really brilliant veg in your spare time?
Yeah, that's right. And yes, I do still work full-time. And yeah, I'm very passionate about sort of removing the barriers to gardening that people sort of have in their heads. So I did a little poll on my Instagram account a while ago, and one of the big things that came up, I asked people what was stopping them from growing food if they wanted to try it but hadn't yet started. And one of the main things that people said was they didn't have time. So I thought, being someone who does have, quite a lot of land to look after, but also a full-time job, I'm quite well placed to kind of help advise on how to garden while saving time. So yeah, that's the book that I'm sort of in the process of writing, but trying to write. I've written bits of it, but haven't yet, got a publisher. So it's very, very early stages. But yeah, that's the book that I would like to write.
How exciting. And sort of like month by month or crop by crop, or how are you going to structure it?
Yeah, good question. I think month by month, I have pitched the idea to a couple of publishers, and they weren't keen on that idea just because of the different regions around the world. So probably going to bin that idea and do it more veg by veg. But there'll be quite a big section on different topics. So, like how to plan ahead, building biodiversity, as we discussed, because if you can get nature to help you with gardening, that does save you a lot of time. And just sort of work through a few different sort of strategies, I guess, to save time in the garden. And then I suppose move on to veg by veg. Like this is how, these are the vegetables that you can grow that are quick and easy. And this is how to grow them.
Yeah, great. So before we finish, maybe you could just, you've already given us one lovely broad bean and basil pesto recipe, but maybe a couple of others before we end?
Yeah, sure. I do like a frittata. We keep hens here, so we get eggs. So that means that frittata is something that we can kind of eat that's completely grown here, which is very satisfying. So in the spring, I like to do a spring frittata with our new potatoes. Or sorry, in the summer, I should say. It's summer now, isn't it? Not spring.
Yeah.
So yeah, some potatoes. I'll sneak an onion out, but just before it's ready. And then some peas and broad beans. So yeah, cook the potatoes, blanch the beans and the peas, and then sweat your onion till it's really like nice and soft and sort of see-through. And then we'll add that all into the egg mixture and put it in the oven. But basically anything that you can find in the garden, I'll just kind of shove it in, and it normally tastes nice.
Fantastic. And greaseproof paper in the bottom, just so that you can then tip it out really easily.
Yes, I learned that the hard way the first time. It took me about a week to wash the pan.
Yeah, exactly. Burnt egg is never a good thing.
Yeah.
And then any other recipes before we end?
Oh yes. So I've been making recently a rhubarb iced tea, which is really nice and very refreshing. So that is, you kind of start almost as if you're making a rhubarb cordial. So it's rhubarb, sugar, lemon juice and water, and simmer that for quite a while just to kind of get all the flavours out. Put that through a sieve and then just add some tea bags to infuse just for a few minutes. And then, yeah, serve over ice with a slice of lemon, and it's very lovely on a hot summer's day.
Fantastic. That sounds very good. So as I said earlier, Jess's recipes will be in the podcast notes. And thanks so much, Jess. It was lovely to chat, and I hope you'll come back maybe in the autumn and the winter, and we can talk about more things that are happening on your smallholding. And in the meantime, I hope lots of you will follow her on Instagram because, as I said right at the start, she's a really fantastic communicator.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've had a lovely time.
Thanks so much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange. And I really enjoyed talking to Jess about her veg growing know-how, really, and how to fit it around a very busy life, which, of course, lots of us have. Next week, I'm back on my own, and I'm going to talk about alliums. Alliums now in the garden, and the ones that I think are particularly spectacular, and alliums to have for Christmas, because now is the time to harvest. So I'm going to give you all the tips for doing that. So see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.